Hi, this is Alex Burton, the Executive Director of the Harry S. Truman Library Institute. I want to welcome you to tonight's program featuring A.J. BAIME in his discussion on his new book, White Lies. And before I introduce A.J., I want to make a few comments, make a few hellos. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. It's going to be a wonderful program. It's nice to be with you. I look forward to being with you in person, hopefully relatively soon as conditions continue to improve, fingers crossed. It's also really affirming to know that despite these unusual circumstances, we can still generate an audience to learn about a really incredible, relatively or almost completely unknown story emanating from Truman's administration, and that the audience currently is around 750 registrants, and we look forward to knowing how many of you are actually out there with us. I want to say hello to my parents who are joining us from Taos, New Mexico, and there are people from all over the country, most states in the nation. Truman is on the rise, so thank you for joining us. Tonight's program is the third installment of our Civil Rights series, To Secure These Rights, which is part of the 75th anniversary program we are offering to honor and celebrate Truman's civil rights legacy and his achievements. I'd like to thank the Boeing Company for generously sponsoring tonight's book event, the series itself, as well as other civil rights activities. And I hope I'm not stepping on AJ's lines here, but I have a few comments to make about the close and strategic relationship between Walter White and President Harry Truman. A search of the online archives of the Truman Library returns more than 50 photographs and scanned documents, from letters to memos to detailed analyses of the Black vote in the 1948 election. And those are just the digitized documents in the collection. There are many more. It would be impossible to overstate the impact Walter White had on President Truman, especially regarding his creation of the President's Civil Rights Committee in 1946 and the 1948 executive orders desegregating the United States Armed Forces and federal workforce. In fact, White began corresponding with the president just months after he was sworn in 1945, alerting him to the realities and horror of segregated soldiers. And of course, the two stood together 75 years ago on June 29th, 1947, in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, where President Truman was the first United States president to address the NAACP. In that historic speech, Truman declared, "We can no longer afford the luxury of a leisurely attack upon prejudice and discrimination. The way is not easy. We shall need all the wisdom, imagination, and courage we can muster." Following that historic event, President Truman underscored the challenge, but also his optimism in a letter to Walter White. He wrote, "Freedom and equality are not easily won, but we will never cease trying to win them. And I, for one, will never lose confidence that we can win them," end quote. Inspiring words, both then and now. Our friend A.J. BAIME has done civil rights history and Truman's legacy a tremendous service by bringing the story of Walter White to light. Many of you know A.J. He's been with us on at least two previous occasions, because he's the best-selling author of The Accidental President, Harry S. Truman and the 4 Months That Changed the World, and Dewey Defeats Truman, the 1948 election and the battle for America's soul. A master storyteller, A.J. is a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal, and his articles have also appeared in the New York Times, Popular Science, Men's Journal, and numerous other publications. His latest book, White Lies, The Double Life of Walter F. White and America's Darkest Secret, was released on February 8th. He is a dear friend of the Truman Library Institute, and it is our absolute pleasure to have him back with us tonight. Thank you all for joining us. Enjoy the program. AJ, Thank you, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you to the Truman Library Institute. The work you do is vital. I just want to say for people listening out there, go to the website, check out what they do, become a part of it. It's a great thing. I want to thank everybody at the Truman Library and Museum. I've spent wonderful times there researching in the years of the past. The work you do there is so vital. The archivists there, as we all know, the preservation of the documents are how we tell the story of our nation's past, of the past of the whole world. And part of the process of understanding the past is how we create our future. And so the work of the archivist there is absolutely vital. The renovation is incredible at the museum. I encourage everybody to see it. If you're not local, it's worth a flight across the country. I want to thank both of my kids, Clay and Odds. Happy birthday this weekend, both of you. And my mother, I think, who's watching, Alice. She's not just my mom, but my IT specialist. And I couldn't do this without you. What am I doing here? I'm here to talk about Walter White. This is the book, White Lies. It came out just a few days ago. Surprisingly, I've been working on this book, it's been brewing in my head for close to 30 years. I first came across Walter White when my first year of graduate school. And even back then, I remember reading just tidbits about this man and thinking, it's bizarre that there's no way that the story of this man's life could be true. But it is. I can also say for the last 4 books I've written, 2 things remain constant. Harry Truman and Walter White have appeared in all of them. So when I finished Dewey Defeats Truman a few years ago, I set out to write this book about Walter White because I couldn't believe that nobody had written it. There was no real mainstream biography about Walter White, Walter Francis White. And whenever I mentioned his name, the only thing people thought about was Breaking Bad. And I thought, that's not going to work for me. So the first thing I did was I went to Yale University. I looked at the archives. That's where Walter's papers are. I went to the public library and the Schomburg Center in Harlem. And I went through, most importantly, the NAACP papers, which is just a treasure trove of material regarding Walter White. And what I found there was more than I hoped to. And I really learned that the story of Walter's life and why we should know about him is really much greater than I even anticipated. So who was Walter White? One way to say this, explain in a very short sentence, you might say, well, Walter Francis White was the most powerful civil rights figure of the first half of the 20th century. And already you're saying to yourself, how can that be? BAIME is making this up. It can't be true. Because if that was true, we would all know who he was. Another way to define Walter is to say, Walter White was sort of the most powerful force behind the historic realignment of Black voting power in America from the Republican to the Democratic Party in the 1930s. And again, you're saying, how can that be true if we've never heard of him? Well, the story of why Walter White's story is lost to history is an integral part of what this book is about and what I'm going to sort of touch on tonight. So I'm going to give you a lot of information and a whole bunch of photographs, but there's so much more. There's only so much I can do in a few, with the time I have, and I don't want to give away all of the secrets of the book, but let me start here. Walter White was born in Atlanta in 1893. He was born into a Black family, went to a Black school, Black church, attended Atlanta University, which was a Black school. But there was something very interesting about him. I should also mention that his parents, George and Madeline White, were born into enslaved families, and they were the last of the last generation that could speak of the slave era as African Americans from experience. Yet there was something distinguishing about Walter. He looked strange to his peers at Atlanta University, in his school and his church. And let's take a look and see what he looked like. So we can start here. This is Walter. And you might notice that he has white skin. You can't tell from this picture, but he has blue eyes. His hair is dark blonde. Here's another photo of Walter. Now, this to me is just such a special photograph because a lot of Walter's family is gone, and a lot of Walter's family sort of disowned him. We'll get to that too later in the story. But I can only find one living member of the White family, and that was Rose Palmer, his niece. And she was 92 years old, living in Atlanta. And brilliantly, she was able to dig up this photograph, scan it, and email it to me, which I thought was really impressive. You'll see Walter here on your right. Why is this graduating class of Atlanta University so small? And the answer to that is because Black Americans at this era had very little access to education, certainly college education. Now, coming of age, Walter obviously had a choice. He knew that he could go out and live his life as a white man or as a Black man. And he had to confront something every time he looked in the mirror. Why was his skin the color that it was? And let me just read the way I put it in the introduction to the book. This family's complexion represented a shameful truth that that generations of enslaved families were born out of illicit encounters between Black women who had no rights to their bodies and white male slave owners who had full legal impunity. Walter's great-grandmother on his mother's side, in fact, birthed 6 children in the 1830s, fathered by her owner, William Henry Harrison, who went on to become president of the United States. Now, Walter, again, he knows he has this choice to live his life as a white man or Black man because nobody would know. But something incredible happened to him when he was 12 years old that set the foundation for his life's work as a sort of maniacal, and I don't use that word loosely, a maniacal seeker of justice in America. And that is when he was 12 years old, he went on his father's mail route. His father was a mail carrier, and after school each day, Walter would go with his father on this mail route. And on this day, I think it was in September 1906, they witnessed the outbreak of the Atlanta race riot of 1906. Now, at the time, photographs didn't really exist. The cameras were hard to come by, and there's very little photographic evidence of this riot, but it was reported so widely that you can see this is actually the cover of a French newspaper. And in France, because photography, they didn't really work in newspapers at that time, they would paint the covers. And you can see across the bottom in small letters, it says Massacre de Negroes, Atlanta, and in parentheses, Georgia. Now, Walter saw this firsthand. He claims to have seen 12 men killed. And on the second night of the Atlanta riot, the white family was in their home, and a white mob appeared at their doorstep with flaming torches and yelling and screaming, saying that the whites' home was too nice of a home for a Black family to live in, and they were going to burn it to the ground. And Walter stood there in the window, and I want to read to you very quickly right here the way his specific memory of this moment was, because this moment is the foundation of his mythology, his life's work, everything he represented, and everything, not just who he was, but who he created himself to be. He wrote, "As a boy in the darkness, amid the tightening fright, I knew the inexplicable thing, that my skin was as white as the skin of those who were coming at me. The mob moved toward the lawn. I tried to aim my gun, wondering what it would feel like to kill a man. In that instance, there opened up within me a great awareness. I knew who I was. I was a Negro. After that night, I never wanted to be a white man. I knew which side I was on." Walter goes into activism in 1917, wants to fight for education for young Black Atlantans. And a certain man in New York City takes notice of him, this guy. Now, you always hear that question, if I could have lunch with anybody in the world, who would I have lunch with? And this guy would be high on my list. This is James Weldon Johnson. Newspaperman, poet, novelist, former diplomat, all-around genius. So James Weldon Johnson discovers, as you would discover an unfound talent, discovers Walter in 1917 and convinces him against his parents' wishes, against Walter's parents' wishes, to move to New York to become part of this organization that few people at that time had heard of, called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So Walter gets there on a freezing cold day early in 1918. He meets the staff. Part of the staff was this man, W.E.B. Du Bois, who had to be the most respected Black intellectual, maybe even to this day. He authored great books, authored the groundbreaking books, The Souls of Black Folks, which I know that students in school is still reading today, and we should all read. This is Du Bois editing the NAACP's magazine. It was called The Crisis, and it was distributed nationally. So Walter begins his work with this small organization that few had heard of at the time. Now there's this amazing cultural forces at this time that are bubbling up in America that begin to shape the world that Walter is living in. One of them is this. I find this photo absolutely extraordinary. You can see the man at the front. You might not be able to read it. He said, his sign at the front says, "The first blood for American independence was shed by a Negro, Crispus Attucks." And what you're looking at is the silent parade of 1917. 10,000 African Americans, women in all white, men in black suits, marching through Manhattan without a sound. And this parade, this event was really what put the NAACP on the map nationally. This is the first time that a lot of people really ever heard of it. So to me, it really symbolizes the coming out of the NAACP as this force that's going to become extremely powerful in the 1920s. Right when Walter gets there, this is starting. At the same time, the modern KKK is founded in 1915, a cross-burning ceremony atop Stone Mountain right outside of downtown Atlanta, where Walter grew up. And so very quickly, the KKK spreads through school boards, local governments, police forces, fire departments, women's clubs, all across the South, beginning to creep into the North. So by the time Walter starts the NAACP in 1918, the KKK is really cementing itself as a force to be reckoned with and becomes an absolute maniacal obsession of Walter's. And as a matter of fact, he tries to join the KKK. I have his application in front of me. Posing as a white man, he wants to infiltrate the Klan. And this is his application. "Is the moving prompting your inquiry serious?" "Yes," he answers. "What is your age?" 27. "What is your occupation?" "Journalist." "Where were you born?" "Atlanta, Georgia." "How long have you been residing in your current present locality?" 3 years. "Are you married, single, or widow?" He is single. Were your parents born in the United States?" He says, "Yes." "Are you a Jew or Gentile?" "Gentile." "Are you of white race or of colored race?" He leaves it blank. "Do you believe in the principles of pure Americanism?" He says, "Yes, I do." So this picture is actually a Klan march in Washington, D.C., 40,000 people. You can see the Capitol in the building in the background. One eyewitness said that there were so many Klansmen that Washington looked like a giant snowbank because it was all white. So this is a force that's bubbling up right when Walter comes of age and moves to New York. And at the same time, he arrives in New York exactly in time to become part of this literary and artistic renaissance we know now as the Harlem Renaissance. So he begins to live a double life, and we shall see how. Now, that's Duke Ellington. All right. Let me set a little scene here. Walter White's first year at the NAACP, it's actually his 12th day. It's his 12th day on the job. He takes the bus with James Weldon Johnson downtown from Harlem to work. And they read an article in the newspaper about the killing and burning at the stake of a man named James McElhare in Estill Springs, Tennessee. They get to the office and they begin to discuss this. Now, typically, this wasn't the first time this happened. What the NAACP would do is write a letter to the President of the United States, write a letter to the governor of the state, write a letter to the mayor of the city where it happened, send that paper, those letters to the newspapers. The black newspapers would publish it. The white newspapers would ignore it. So this time, Walter's sitting there and he says, "I have an idea. Let me go down there and I can investigate." And everybody's against it because they say it's too dangerous, but Walter convinces them. He gets on a train, he goes to Chattanooga, he poses as white so he can stay in a hotel. And then he takes another train to Estill Springs. And he pretends, he creates this persona. He's going to be a traveling salesman with the Excellento Medicine Company. And in one day of sleuthing, he's able to get all of these people to admit who had committed the crime, what exactly had happened. He goes back to New York and writes an article in the NAACP's news magazine, The Crisis, and it causes a sensation. And this leads Walter to begin living a double life, which is why the book is called The Double Life of Walter White. First half is really about Walter White during the 1920s, rising up in the NAACP, living outwardly in New York, as a Black man. Here's Langston Hughes. These are all his friends. Charles S. Johnson, the short story writer, brilliant Rudolph Fisher, second from the right. He becomes living out outwardly, and part of the Harlem Renaissance. He becomes a famed novelist, but at the same time, he begins living an undercover life in the South, and he conducts over 40 investigations posing as a white man throughout the 1920s. In my research, I was able to find his handwritten notes, his internal NAACP memorandums, the newspaper and magazine articles that he wrote about these investigations, which caused sensational headlines. And if you think about it, these investigations began to make Walter White very, very famous in Harlem. He became known for them. People wanted to give him speaking engagements so he could talk about his work. And the more famous he became, the more dangerous it became every time he went undercover, which he did throughout the decade. This picture is of the Chicago race riot, which was of the biggest race riot of the Red Summer of 1919. Walter was there investigating. This is Tulsa. Now, Tulsa has been in the news quite a bit recently, 1921. What you're seeing here is the burning of the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa. What happened was a false accusation of rape of a young man named Dick Rowland, who was never even charged with any crime, resulted in the rampaging and burning to the ground of an entire 40-block neighborhood of Tulsa called Greenwood. There was actually eyewitnesses of airplanes, rudimentary airplanes. There weren't very many well-constructed airplanes in 1921, but airplanes flying around over Greenwood, dropping firebombs out the side. Walter arrived 2 days after, and in a bizarre ceremony in Tulsa City Hall, he posed as a white man and was actually deputized to go out and was embedded with a crew of white men to police the city of Tulsa as the smoke is still swirling, to police against Black uprising. And he came back and he wrote a shocking article in The Nation. I'll read a tiny piece of it to you. There is a lesson in the Tulsa affair for every American who fatuously believes that Negroes will always be the meek and submissive creatures that circumstances have forced them to be during the past 300 years. Dick Rowland was only an ordinary bootblack with no standing in the community. But when his life was threatened by a mob of whites, every one of the 15,000 Negroes in Tulsa was willing to die to protect Dick Rowland. Perhaps America is waiting for a nationwide Tulsa to wake her. It's pretty terrifying stuff. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and just talk without pictures. Hopefully you can see me. I just want to say a couple of things about when I write these books, you know, a lot of research goes into them, but they're slightly non-traditional. And what I try to do is to make readers understand not just what happened, not just why it happened, but if I can, to make the readers feel the emotions of the people that I'm writing about. And I know when I'm writing them, I feel them. It's, you know, sometimes it's fun and it's funny. Sometimes it's really not as painful. That might be one of the reasons why my books aren't always very well received in the very academic community, because they're not exactly like all other books. I try to take them in different places a little bit. But the story of Walter White, what I really want to say is, I'm hoping that comes across. And there's one specific incident that in the middle of the book, it occurs in 1925, 1926, and it's the story of a man named Ozion Sweet. And I'm guessing that, geez, there's 400 people watching right now. And I'm guessing that there's very few, if any, who know who Dr. Sweet is. And I think we need to write that. So I'm going to tell the story very briefly. Dr. Sweet was a successful Black physician in the city of Detroit who moved into a new family home at 2905 Garland Avenue in Detroit. And he was successful. He had a 14-month-old child, his wife, and the night he moved in, his brothers and sisters and family, there was 12 of them there in the house that night. And his wife was cooking a celebratory dinner. And at sundown, a mob gathered outside of his home. Eyewitnesses said that the mob was bigger than 2,000 people. And suddenly rocks and stones started hitting the house and breaking all the windows, and a shot was fired. And a white man was killed outside Dr. Sweet's home. And the police raided the place and arrested all of them and charged them all with murder. And the NAACP branch in Detroit immediately called the national headquarters and wrote all these telegrams. I have a couple here. And the W. Hayes McKinney of the Detroit branch wrote, "It will be necessary to have an experienced investigator to secure evidence to aid in the defense of this case. We are therefore urgently requesting that Mr. White be sent to Detroit immediately." Now, this case captured the imagination of America. Walter figured there was no way that an all-white jury was going to acquit this guy, any of them. They were going to go to the gallows. And Walter had the idea to hire this man who had just become the most famous attorney in America, this man, Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow, when he first met with Walter and two other white lawyers, he had heard that one of them was African-American. So he turned to one of the lawyers and said, "I understand the suffering of your people." And this lawyer said, "I'm sorry, I'm a white man." So he turned to the next man and said, "I understand the suffering of your people." And this lawyer said, "I'm sorry, I'm a white man." So he turned to Walter and he said, "I was told one of you was a Negro." That was the term of the time. And he looked at Walter and he said, "Surely it can't be you." But what happened next to me is extraordinary. They fought this case. Clarence Darrow freed the Sweet family. They were found innocent. But what's more important in terms of Walter White's life is Clarence Darrow came to give a speech in Harlem. And what he said changed the trajectory of Walter White and set the stage for the second half of White Lies, because the second half is about politics, where Harry Truman comes in. Clarence Darrow says in his speech in this Harlem church, "African Americans in this country for generations vote for the Republican Party with that question all the time. And if anyone didn't vote for the African American for the Republican Party, it would be considered, treachery and betrayal. Because Abraham Lincoln had freed the slaves. And so we must, everybody who's black has to vote for the party of Lincoln." And Darrow says, "You're wasting your vote." And he says, "The future of black power is at the ballot box. And if you only realize the power that you can have if you organize voting in the northern states," because remember, in the South, African Americans were not allowed to vote. But in the North, in certain states, if they organized and got behind a candidate that wasn't necessarily Republican, they might hold the balance of power. And people would finally say, "We have to pay attention to this race of our country, makes up 10% of our country." And Walter is amazed. He's dumbfounded. He decides to throw himself into national politics and ultimately names his only son, Walter Jr., Walter Carl Darrow White, because of Clarence Darrow. So for Walter, all roads end at the White House. He realizes he has to get in the White House. By this time, by the way, he is chief executive of the NAACP. So he starts in 1918. The NAACP is this tiny organization. And because of the efforts of all of the staff, James Weldon Johnson, W.E.B. Du Bois, people like Mary White Ovington, who they called the fighting saint, this old white woman who was so dedicated to civil rights activism that she was a board member of the NAACP. But Walter became chief executive in 1930. And by that time, it's the most powerful militant civil rights organization that had ever existed. But he can't get in the door of the White House because FDR realizes that if he makes any, meets any demands of Walter White or, supports civil rights in any way, he's going to extremely anger a vast and very powerful part of the Democratic Party, which is the Solid South. This is a lot of information in a short period of time, but in the book, it's all very clear. So Walter can't get in to see FDR, but Mrs. Roosevelt reaches out and they create this incredible bond that I just found so endearing. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt had the ear of the president, and she convinces the president to meet with Walter. And that begins this relationship in which amazing things happen. At the same time, Walter is working politically to reorganize voting power. And he goes out and he says to his people, don't just vote Democratic or Republican. In your community, vote for the candidate that is going to support civil rights. Vote for the candidate that is going to say, yes, we believe in the 14th Amendment. Yes, we believe in the 15th Amendment. And slowly, Democratic politicians in the North begin to realize this, and there's a groundswell, a shift in power. And I'll point out that in 1932, the year Roosevelt was elected, was the first year that there was a trickle of Black votes to the Democratic column. It hadn't happened in generations. But by 1936, Black America voted overwhelmingly for the Democrats. It was shocking to many people, but that's where the party vote is still to this day. Okay, I love this picture. It just speaks volumes to me. What you're looking at is Walter White in the middle. That's Thurgood Marshall on your right, and Roy Wilkins on your left. Roy Wilkins took over the NAACP and led it after Walter's death for many, many years. In 1935, Walter hires this young hotshot lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, to launch a new arm of the NAACP. And they were going to fight for education rights in the courts, and they were going to fight for voting rights. And Thurgood Marshall, turns out, was a genius. And he formed this bond with Walter. They both loved to stay up late at night. They both loved to drink a lot of whiskey and smoke cigarettes and tell stories. So while Walter's working on politics, Thurgood Marshall is building these education cases that rise up to the Supreme Court and ultimately climax with Brown versus Board of Education in 1955, which Walter lives, 1954, barely long enough to live, to see. Okay, which brings us to Harry Truman. So by the time Harry Truman becomes president, Walter is a political force in America. He is the face of Black power. And you ask yourself how amazingly ironic that is, with white skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair. He forged this relationship with Truman for a very interesting reason. Well, the reasons are obvious, but he became friendly with Truman. Then this happened. Now, what you're looking at here, that's former heavyweight champion Joe Louis on your left. And that is an unknown figure on your right. And in the middle is a man named Isaac Woodard. And Isaac Woodard's story was incredible and indicative of something very scary in America at the time. Isaac Woodard comes home from war. He's wearing his uniform, Army uniform, metal pinned to his chest. He is carrying his papers from being released from the Army with the mimeograph signature of Harry Truman on it. And he's empowered. All of these men are coming back from war. They served their country. And Black soldiers didn't want to go back to the Jim Crow South that they had come to before the war. They felt that they had earned rights and they had earned respect. And they wanted things like the 14th and 15th Amendment to mean something. So maybe Isaac Woodard had a chip on his shoulder, but that would have been his only fault. He got in a fight with the policeman and he was permanently blinded and had no recourse to the law and had no money, no way to support his family. And he ends up in Walter White's office. And Walter makes him a cause celeb, takes him on a speaking tour around the country, headlines in all the newspapers, because by this time, if Walter calls the newspapers, they run the stories. And ultimately, he goes and has this extraordinary meeting with Harry Truman. And this is in 1946. And that's where Truman realizes that if this is a country where there are Black people coming home from war who would serve their country in war, who are willing to die for their country in war, and we're not allowed to sit next to a white person on a bus, that's one thing. But if they should come home from war and be beaten on the streets of their own country, this was wrong. And so the very next day, after Walter came to his office and told him the story of Isaac Woodard and others who had suffered similar fate, Truman wrote a memorandum the very next day to his Attorney General, Tom Clark of Texas. And he wrote, I had as callers yesterday some members of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Truman was, quote, alarmed at the increased racial feeling all over the country. And this began, for me, what I think of as the beginning of the civil rights movement, modern civil rights movement, from mainstream politics, from within the White House. And we know what happened next. Truman desegregated the military by executive order. He became the first sitting president to campaign in 1948 in the spiritual home of Black America in Harlem, a very moving moment that I wrote a bunch about in my book, Dewey Defeats Truman. And here he is. Walter White convinces Truman to become the first president to address the NAACP in person. The picture you're looking at is Walter on your right, it's Truman on your left, Eleanor Roosevelt is in the middle. Eleanor spoke first, the former first lady, and then Walter got up and he introduced the president. He gave this very moving speech that I don't have time to tell you about now, but I quote at length in White Lies. And then he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States." And then we see this. That is what it looked like. You can see Truman's back to the camera, speaking to the NAACP the first time, a very historic speech. And it was the symbolic importance of this moment is that the White House, for the first time in history, was going to say what Truman said, which is that this Bill of Rights in our country shouldn't just exist. People say they believe in the Constitution, but they also believe in white supremacy. There's a gap there. It doesn't make sense, and it's obvious. And when I write in my subtitle, The Double Life of Walter White, America's Darkest Secret, Walter's living a double life in the 1920s, investigating as a white man and member of the Harlem Renaissance as a Black man. In the 1930s, he lives a double life because he's living in high society among high, powerful politicians and powerful white people, but he's the head of the NAACP. Not everybody trusted him for this, but Truman did. And Truman proved it by coming and giving this speech that at the time, Walter White thought was going to be political suicide, but it turned out not to be. I'm going to play a tiny little clip of it.
1, 2, 3.
I should like to talk to you briefly about civil rights and human freedom. It is my deep conviction that we have reached a turning point in the long history of our country's efforts to guarantee freedom and equality to all our citizens.
Okay, which brings us sort of to the end of my talk. I'm going to solve the mystery that I brought up at the beginning. Why don't we know who this man is today? Well, let's answer the question. Here you see Walter. This is in the 1930s. He's chief executive of the NAACP. He's become a political powerhouse. To his right is his son, Walter Jr., Walter Carl Darrow White. Behind him is his wife, Gladys. And they're living openly in Harlem as a Black family. At the same time, Walter was often attacked because of his identity. People like W.E.B. Du Bois became his nemesis because they claimed that Walter wasn't Black at all. And Walter said, yes, he was. He always stood by his identity as a Black man. But people sometimes attacked him for it, called him a fraud. But at the same time, he was secretly in love with this woman. This is Walter with Poppy Cannon, late in his life. And at the end of his life, he knew he was dying. He literally drank and smoked and worked himself to death. He worked himself to death. And he was dying, he was having heart attacks. And at the end of his life, he decided that he wanted to die in love and left his wife for this woman. And the man who was for most of his life the most powerful civil rights figure in America became a tabloid scandal. And it destroyed his reputation. He remained chief executive of the NAACP for to the end of his life for the next 5 years, but he was a figurehead and a lot of people paid no attention to him anymore. At the same time, you have to imagine, right when he died in 1955 is right when the Montgomery bus boycott was occurring and televisions were coming on the scene. And the new face, the new generation of civil rights leader, people obviously like Martin Luther King, were not going to be comfortable with having a man who looked white as the foundation of their movement. And Walter's life work was immediately lost to history. Because of his marriage, his kids disowned him and he was destroyed and he died that way. And that's why I think nobody knows who he is today. He was a deeply faulted man. He was ambitious to a fault. He could be terribly manipulative, but his actions and his successes, I think, speak for themselves, and I think people need to know about them. Lastly, I will say, I want to cover the book and just tell a story very briefly. I remember being on C-SPAN TV at the beginning of my career, talking about a book called The Arsenal of Democracy. It was on live TV, and they said, does anybody in the audience want to ask a question? And my 7-year-old son stood up and asked for the microphone, and I was terrified because I didn't know what he was going to say. And he grabbed the microphone and he said, "Dad," and everybody laughed. But then he asked a very poignant question. He said, "How did you choose the picture that's on the cover?" And when we chose this cover, this is a real flag that used to fly outside of NAACP offices the day after something terrible happened. And that's New York in the background. I didn't want people to look at the cover and think it was a biography, just a biography of a man they'd never heard of. I wanted them to know that it's about something a lot more. And that's where the cover comes from. Now, I have 30 seconds more. I just want to say, as a sort of awkward coda, I want to thank everybody. I can see there's 400 people here. And I know we lost some people because people are reading their newspapers. They're glued to their TVs because of the terrible things that are happening. And we're all scared and we all feel it. But something occurred to me when I was watching the television last night. I'm going to read a Truman quote and I'll be done. Truman once wrote, "The history of the world has moved in cycles, and that very often we find ourselves in the midst of political circumstances which appear to be new, but which might have existed in almost identical form at various times during the past 6,000 years. And the story that's unfolding right at this moment on our televisions is very, very similar to what Truman faced at the Potsdam Conference, negotiating with Joseph Stalin over the government of Poland in 1945. That same year, the United Nations was founded in San Francisco. Walter White was at the founding conference in San Francisco, so was Harry Truman. And the UN was founded in hopes that it could confront and solve terrifying issues like we're seeing right now. Let's hope it works. I'm not a big praying guy, but I'm praying. So thank you very much. Thank you for having me. There's a lot more to this book that I didn't talk about, so I hope people read it. So I think there's time for questions. Don't be afraid to ask the hard ones.
All right. Thank you, AJ, for that thought-provoking presentation. If you have a question and haven't added it to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, please go ahead and do so now. You can also like a question that's already been submitted that you would like to see answered. So our first question tonight comes from Ed, and Ed asks, based on race riots in northern cities and the story you had of the incident in Detroit, how free were Blacks to vote in the North, i.e., even if better than the South, was there still voter suppression in the North?
Well, obviously there would have been voter suppression everywhere, and there is today. But the difference was immense in terms of what was happening in the North and what was happening in the South. Now, Walter, when he moved north to New York, he was really part of something called the Great Migration. And this was the migration of hundreds of thousands of people, a lot of African Americans from the South fleeing Jim Crow for industrial jobs in the North, where they would be treated better and where they could vote. And so the answer to the question is, yes, people were much more free to vote in northern states, and they began to be freer to vote in southern states right at the end of Walter's life, specifically the midterm elections in 1946 and 1948. But let me point out that the riot that changed Walter's life in Atlanta in 1906, a lot of it had to do with the gubernatorial election of that year. And both the candidates, both white obviously, for the governor of Georgia, were promising that if they were elected the governor, that they would make it illegal for Black people to vote. And that's exactly what happened. So in 1908, when Walter was a kid, it was suddenly become, impossible to vote in those states. And that happened for 40 years throughout Walter's life. In northern states, you could vote in New York, you could vote in Massachusetts.
All right, our next question comes from Barbara. And Barbara says, from what I learned about Isaac Woodard, he didn't get in a fight with a policeman, but rather was attacked by police that the bus driver asked to come on to bother or arrest Isaac for asking to leave the bus to use the restroom when the bus made a stop. Can you just talk a little bit about the circumstances of Isaac Woodard?
Okay, that's a great question, and you're absolutely right. So what happened was Isaac was on the bus, and there were other soldiers there who were witnesses to what happened and later came forward, and the bus stopped, and Isaac, there would have been no bathroom in the bus, and it was a long ride. He was going to visit, going back, he'd been away from his family for a long time, serving in the Far East in the war. And when the bus stopped, he asked the driver if he could use the bathroom. And the driver was very disrespectful. And I'm saying as close as I can remember the actual quote, but Isaac said something like, hey, talk to me like I talk to you, have respect, something like that. And the police officers didn't like that. I mean, the bus driver didn't like this. He let Isaac go to the bathroom. Isaac came back on, and the bus driver drove on and stopped and found a police officer and went out and got this police officer to take Isaac off the bus. And these police officers, from what I understand from court testimony, which I have in that drawer right there, they were, the way Isaac tells the story is that they were moving him along and pushing him, and he didn't know where, and they wrenched his arm behind his back, and he was scared, so he struggled, and a fight occurred, and they threatened to shoot him. And one of the officers had a billy club, and the end of the billy club got driven into both of his eyes, and he was blinded, and he was unconscious. And when he woke up in a prison cell, he was blinded. He couldn't see. He was charged with a crime, and he ended up, the officers at the prison realized that he was injured and took him to a hospital where he stayed and never regained his sight. He ended up going home to his mother's home in Harlem, and he was helpless. And that's when I think it was a cousin of his said, maybe the NAACP can help. And there's this amazing moment where Isaac Woodard shows up in Walter White's office asking for help, and he reaches out as a blind man to shake Walter's hand, and he can't find Walter. And Walter realizes that what had happened to Isaac was shockingly horrible, but also realizes that this could be a case that could explode nationwide with publicity, which is exactly what happened. So I hope that answers the question.
Excellent. All right. Our next question comes from Evelyn, a quick one here. What's the name of the woman that Walter left his wife for?
Her name was Poppy Cannon. Her papers are at Yale University, so you can read the letters back and forth between them. She was actually a very interesting woman. She was a contemporary of Julia Child. She was a food editor at Mademoiselle magazine, and she worked in the advertising industry. She had kids, 2 kids from 2 different marriages, a very non-traditional woman. And she went on to have her own cooking TV show, but at that point, Walter had passed on. But her name was Poppy Cannon. She wrote a book about Walter called The Gentle Giant, I think it's called. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. But she wrote a book about him that's a really interesting window into his life, and also into what was happening at that time.
Excellent. All right. Our next question comes from Roberta, who asks, what is the current narrative within the leadership of the Black community, including the NAACP, about the contributions of White?
That's a tricky question, because I can say there isn't one, because Walter White's life is not discussed. He doesn't appear in the history books. He doesn't appear in the news. No one quotes him. So I don't think there's really much dialogue at all.
All right. Barbara asks, could a Walter White succeed in undercover work today?
No. And I think that one of the things that made his work so intriguing is that it happened in an era before cell phone cameras, before mass media of any kind. And that is the reason why Walter was able to live openly and become famous in Harlem for these investigations he was conducting, with his name, his face and his name appearing in newspapers, and then could go undercover in the South again. I think it's really important to understand, one of the things that I found fascinating that I've always wanted to write about is like the effect that the mega metropolis has on creating powerful people. But at the same time, the opposite end of that is to look at very insular rural communities where these crimes tended to happen. And let me say that some of these crimes happen in front of crowds larger than those at some Major League Baseball games, in these tiny little places. And no one would ever be charged for a crime. And how could that happen? Because there were no cameras, no camera phones, very few telephones. And law enforcement never charged anybody for these crimes. It wasn't in their best interest. Politicians, it wasn't in their best interest either. So in these tiny insular communities, the families of these victims had no recourse to the law, no recourse to the ballot box, no recourse whatsoever.
Okay. I'm going to ask the next two questions together because I think they dovetail very nicely. Jeff asks, did White ever write about the 1908 race riot in Springfield, Illinois? And John is asking about the terms we use and is saying, isn't it fundamentally misleading to describe organized massacres of African Americans as race riots? Will you take a stab at each of those?
Yes. No is the answer to the first, because Walter would have been pretty young at that time, and I don't have any record. I never saw any record of him writing about that incident. The second question, Walter, that's a very interesting question, and Walter distinguished between the two. The way he said, talks of his career is that he conducted 40 undercover investigations of lynchings and investigated 6 race riots. So in his mind and mine too, there's absolutely a difference between the two. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. I could go on, but I think that gets to the point.
Yeah. All right, we have time for a few more questions here. Our next question comes from Rick, who asks, what was the closest call Walter had to being found out while doing his investigations?
That's a great question. Walter, he wrote an article describing exactly that, and it was published in the magazine American Mercury in 1930 or 1929. The article was called "I Investigate Lynchings," and it was a first-person story talking about these investigations. And he addresses exactly that. It was in Elaine, Arkansas. And in this moment, Walter's investigating, he's undercover, and he knows that if his identity is discovered, he's in for real trouble, because you have to remember that the crimes he was investigating were incredibly, incredibly gruesome. And at times it became very difficult for me to decide, writing the book, what I should leave in and what I should leave out, because I didn't want to make the crimes themselves seem less appalling, but I didn't want to make it too difficult that nobody would read. So these decisions were very difficult. But the point I want to make is Walter White would have known if these crimes were so appalling, what these people in these tiny communities who could act with impunity would do to him. And the closest call he got, he was in the town of Elaine, and a tiny town, and a black man came to him and whispered in his ear, "They know who you are. You're in trouble. You have to get out of here." And if I could flip to the page very quickly, I would, but I can't. So he literally runs to the train station, and he gets there, and he asks for a ticket out of town. And it's such a small town that there's only 2 trains that come and go. And the man behind the ticket window says, "Man," I'm paraphrasing, "why do you want to leave now? There's a bleep posing as a white man in this town, and he's been found out, and quote, the boys are going to have some fun with him." And he realizes what he's in for, and boom, the train comes up, and he's able to get on the train and escape. That's the moment. That's his closest call. But another thing that I found so fascinating is at one point in the book, he goes to investigate. There's quite a few chapters about this in 1930, this horrific incident that happened in Indiana, in Marion, Indiana. And it's the first time that he has this correspondence with the head of the NAACP branch in Marion, Indiana. Her name is Flossie Bailey. And he asks her straight up, he's like, "Should I come undercover as a white man, or should I come as a black man as the head of the NAACP?" And she says, "You should come as the head of the most militant civil rights organization in the country." She doesn't say why. I think she probably thought that would be most effective in gaining justice for the victims, but also this whole sense that Walter probably by that time was way too famous and he could no longer pass.
All right, we're going to end on this question from Kim, which Kim asks, "We're recycling the fight for civil rights now. What will it take to break this cycle of taking away the rights of others?
You know, that's a fascinating question. You know what? The first thing I can do and say to answer that question, and I promise you I'm not shilling books, is it's very important that we understand that everything we're experiencing now is not new. Everything, all of these things that we're talking about, voting rights, George Floyd, all of this stuff comes from somewhere. It's not new. This has been going on in our country for generations. And I'll tell you, in Walter White's era, it was far worse than it is now. We can't let it go back there. We can't let it happen. So I think the first thing we have to do is understand the history and of where all of this is coming from. It's not coming out of nowhere. And the second thing is vote. Vote. If they say you can't vote unless you do this, 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 and this, you got to do this, this, and this, and we got to do everything to fight. The one thing that, you know, I think that if you're a Democrat and you're liberal, if you're a Republican, you're conservative, that's fine. The one thing that I truly believe is that everybody should be allowed to vote. And I think the suppression of votes is a tragedy. And I just don't understand why anybody would want that to happen.
All right. AJ, thank you for sharing this incredible story with us this evening. And thanks again to Boeing for sponsoring this series. To learn more about Truman's civil rights legacy and the impact of Walter White, you can purchase White Lies, The Double Life of Walter F. White and America's Darkest Secret anywhere books are sold, including Rainy Day Books right here in Kansas City. They do have it in stock. Don't miss our exciting upcoming programs, including the inaugural event in our annual Women Rising series featuring Catherine Sharp Landick. She'll be speaking about her book, The Women with Silver Wings, the inspiring true story of the women Air Force service pilots of World War II. This year's Wild About Harry Gala will be on April 28th at the Mulebach Hotel. Join us for an unforgettable evening honoring Harry S. Truman and raising funds for his presidential library. This year's honoree is William J. Burns, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. We hope to see you all there. To register or find more information about these exciting events, please visit our website at trumanlibraryinstitute.org. And don't forget, tickets are on sale now to visit the all-new Truman Library. Reservations are required in advance for all visitors. As always, members enjoy the benefit of free year-round access to the museum. To become a member or purchase your tickets, visit our website at trumanlibraryinstitute.org. AJ, once again, I can't thank you enough for being here tonight and for sharing this incredible story. And to all of you who joined us this evening, thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you.